Welcome back to AP Human Geography. Let's go ahead and talk today about United States migration. Now, when we talk about this migration, we're going to talk about the patterns and trends, both historically that we've seen the migration patterns to and from the United States, but as well as what has happened internally in the United States when it comes to migration. So when we talk about migration, when we get into the discussion of how this can occur and the immigration timeline. So we can go back to the many different waves, the waves of migration starting here. And so when we look at the waves of migration, what we see is some of the early migrations going to come over from in the colonial era. You're coming over from Great Britain, coming over even. Think about the French and the Spanish settlements and stuff. Then we think about the African slave trade during that colonial period of everything that was occurring pre-American Revolution. And then we get into colonizations occurred. We become a country. Now our influx of populations going to come from European descent. So we're going to talk about different types of the waves of migration. We're going to talk about as we come from European immigration, all the different locations that we come from in Europe and the different waves in which we change the location of Europe that we come from. And then what's more of our contemporary type of timeline? Where are they starting to come from post World War II all the way through today? So a lot of this, again, you'll see in your textbook and your reading if you've been doing your reading and keeping up with that. Does a great job talking about the changes across U.S. Immigration. So let's go ahead and begin with the waves of migration. So again, we're going to talk about four major waves of U.S. migration. All right, we're going to talk about why they're coming to the United States, where they're coming from, and how the source and where the location has changed across time from where people are coming to the United States from in the world. So if we look here at the colonial era, you kind of look at these maps and it gives you a good idea. We know that much of our colonization this time is going to be from Europe. All right, we talked about colonial era, talking about going from Jamestown all the way through the beginning of the American Revolution in this wave. And this colonial era wave, we see again, this is the British colonies. We establish our colonies in this regard. We also have some French that were settling up in the northern regions. We have some Spanish in the southern regions. And we can't forget about the Atlantic slave trade. And so this is where we see a large migration. Again, this was not a voluntary migration. This was the forced migration, which we see the triangular slave trade. All right, the slave trade of bringing African slaves over into the American colonies. So this is going to be where you saw your migrants coming from in wave one. And again, with the main reason of colonization. Then we move to wave two. All right, in wave two, we're going to start to see some continued migration coming in this 19th century. All right, talking about the 1800s now. So we are the United States of America here, and we're going to talk about where a lot of them come from. Before 1840, most of your immigrants are going to come from England. Again, obviously, we have colonization, then we have our independence, and family starts to come over through what we call chain migration. And then in about the 1840s and 50s, we also continue to see Northern and Western Europe continuing to be a location that people come from. And so we see a large number of Irish immigrants starting to come down at this time, and you'll even see some German immigrants make their way across. But just remember, during wave one, we talk about many come from England. All right, so Northern and Western Europe. Same thing in wave two. We see Northern and Western Europe still continuing, but we don't see the slave trade anymore. So we're not bringing in any more migrants from Africa as slaves. So we see wave one and wave two, we see similarities of Northern and Western Europe. And then we move into wave three. This is when we get into the 1900s, so early 20th century. And we're still going to continue to come from Europe, but now we're going to change because what has happened is we've seen the Industrial Revolution. And as the Industrial Revolution has occurred, we see more and more migrants starting to come from different parts. All right. Wave three, it's mainly Northern and Western Europe. But then also what we start to see during this time is now we start to see more of an Eastern and a Southern European route. And this Eastern and Southern European route that we're going to start to see, we're going to start people start coming from places like Italy. We're going to start to see Austrians, Hungarians, Russians. You're going to see people coming from the other regions and the Slavic regions. So now what starts to happen is, remember in wave one and wave two, it's Northern and Western European. So they're coming over people that really understand the English language. People come over that are Protestant and practice the Protestant religion. And then we get into wave three, and now things start to change. Because now we have people coming from Slavic areas or more Southern and Eastern European areas that don't speak the same language, that don't speak the English language as well as the first settlers did and the first couple waves did. So now people are coming in that don't worship the same as well. You have less of a Protestant majority coming in, more maybe of a Catholic and Orthodox majority. That changes the balance. So now in this wave, what we really start to see is we start to see a change and a shift in the mentality at home and say, you know what? We're not really sure if we want all these different kind of immigrants here. Immigrants are good if they come from certain areas, but then we start to exclude certain kinds of immigrants. So in wave three is when we start to see the Quota Act start to become enacted. And when this Quota Act comes in, it starts to restrict the number of migrants that can come in from certain European countries and even Asian and other regions around the world. But what we really start to see is this is the change. This is where we start to see the first use of government policy restricting migration into the United States. And that'll be something that we talk about later on in this unit as well. And then we get to the fourth wave, the final wave of migration, more contemporary. We're talking about late 20th century to modern, early 21st century. And what we see in this time period is we start to see more of a migration trend coming from Asia, all right, as well as regions of Latin America. And that's when we think about many of our migrants today. If they're coming from Asia, they're probably not coming to the East Coast as often. They're probably starting coming over to the West Coast and then may continue their trend over East. But again, they're going to come from Asia. They're going to make it more to the West Coast. And then we see more of a Latin American migration, predominantly from Mexico. With the proximity there, we see a large Mexican migration and other Latino migration into the United States. So those, again, we see a different trend and a different wave throughout these time periods. So if we get a good little look and kind of an idea, if we look across history and where these immigrants are all coming from, this map gives you a really good location, gives you a good idea of where they're coming from. We can see the Europeans, all right, coming from the different parts of Europe and where they're migrating to in the United States. We see the Asians coming across to the West Coast. And if you notice on this little graphic, you see as they come to the West Coast, that's when they can make their migratory patterns to large cities on the Eastern Coast as well. So they will originate here on the West Coast, but then obviously they make their migratory route and they come across to major Eastern Europe, Eastern North American and United States cities. So we see the migration patterns, we see these trends, and we see these flows in the waves of U.S. migration. So since 1910, all right, how has migration really changed in the last century or so? Well, you see a shift from predominantly European, all right, and European continues to go down. But by the time we look here, it's very minor European, all right? We see very minor European and African. Much of ours, again, which makes sense, Mexico is the number one proximity, many other ones from Asia, and then other Central and South American, Latin American regions of the world. So that is your waves of migration. All right, that talks about the different ways, and it talks about how migration into the United States has changed over the course of our history. And as we look, here's another little graphic that'll give you an idea. All right, Northern and Western European, all right, is the wave one, as well as Africans. All right, then wave two, we still see Northern and Western Europeans. Wave three, we start to see Southern and Eastern Europeans. Wave four is when we start to see more Latin American and Asian migration patterns. Again, a little bit little clips here. All right, we talk about having to come across a border. We'll get into those questions when we talk about border and border policy a little bit of push and pull factors. We see the establishments, again, the acceptance of coming into migration patterns along Ellis Island and Angel Island out on the West Coast. So if we look about different parts of Asia, where are they coming from to the United States? Well, they're going to come to the West Coast because of, again, being closer proximity there. And as they cross the Atlantic Ocean, right? No, yes, the Pacific Ocean. All right, so as they cross this Pacific Ocean over here, we're going to start to see locations like China. We're going to see a large Indian population coming over, as well as a Filipino. And if you understand the Spanish-American War, you'll understand that one a little bit of why that come, and then Vietnamese and everything that has occurred. So when we start to see the influx again, large Asian migration to the West Coast, a lot of them stay in that area, but some will continue. Then we look at the Latin American migration. Number one overall Latin American source country is going to be Mexico because of proximity. And then we have other Central American and South American countries, as well as our Caribbean islands from Latin America. So what has happened because of migration to the United States? Well, for a long time, what we really see is we have become what we call a melting pot, or some people call it a salad bowl. You kind of mix everything together. The issue that people do discuss and they talk about is undocumented immigration, which we'll get into that when we get into government policies. Over 50% of all immigrants to the U.S. come to four major states. All right, California, thinking about the West Coast. East Coast, think of New York. All right. And then think of proximity to parts in Latin America, Texas. All right. And then Florida in the Caribbean regions. So when we think about these areas, it's all about proximity. It goes into Ravenstein's laws of migration. All right. You're going to go shorter distances, but also you're going to go to bigger cities. So the large cities in California, New York City itself, and then the proximity to Texas from Latin America, as well as Florida to Latin America. So what that brings up is some questions of security issues, which we'll talk about. So where do a lot of your undocumented immigrants go? Well, you're going to come through here through Mexico, but not just from Mexico, other Latin American countries you're going to come up through. And you're going to see a large undocumented territory down here near Mexico, down here in Texas, and even parts of California. But you're going to see a large other undocumented immigrants. So those are things that, again, we'll talk about when we get more into government policy. So what laws do we see? Hopefully we're seeing several different laws. So if we look here, all right, think about which of these laws of migration these are going to relate to. All right, this is a good way to apply your information to understand, do we understand the laws of migration? Well, let's get into now what happens when people are here. People in the United States, not just immigrants. All right, so what is our internal migration pattern? All right, we're internally migrating throughout the U.S. What does that look like? Well, again, if you read your text and you see things like that, you'll have a good understanding of it because it does talk about it and the shifting in the center of our population. But much of our shifting is going to see a movement from what we call the Rust Belt, the northeastern manufacturing regions that are no longer using a lot of manufacturing, down into the Sun Belt, all right, the more south and southwest regions of the United States. So when we see internal migration, it's that migratory pattern from the northeast to the south and the southwest. So if we think about these, we're going to talk about several different kinds of migration. All right, we're going to talk about urbanization, suburbanization, and then counter-urbanization, and how that changes things in the process of where people will live. So if we looked at this, again, another good graphic here that shows you much of the movement. All right, 1995 versus 2003, what it looked like. A major mass movement down into the south and the west. All right, you don't see a mass movement up into the north and the north, east, or the Midwest. And much of it is going to be south and southwest. We look at migratory patterns by state. All right, the locations that'll increase. You're going to see much more of your Sun Belt locations increasing with the growth of their populations, which when we get to the political unit, we'll talk about how that plays a role. So internal migration, one of the major ones right here is urbanization. All right. So when we talk about urbanization, and this isn't just U.S., but we're going to talk about the U.S. migration first. All right. But urbanization, or when we talk about urbanization, this is going to be one of the most prominent types of intra-regional migration. All right. So we're staying within the same region of areas. Much of the population in countries that are going to be more urbanized has changed today. It used to be only had about 5% of the world's population right around the Industrial Revolution. But post-Industrial Revolution until today, you're talking about 75% of the world's population is going to live in an urban area. The fastest growing urban areas, and make sure we understand this, the fastest growing urban areas are going to be places in more less developed countries. All right. So you're more of the LDCs are going to be your urbanized areas. Why? Because their economic structure cannot support places outside of the city. So many people flock to these areas, and this is where we see overpopulation and higher densities. In right over here, we look at eastern parts of China. Why is it so high in density? Well, that's where their major manufacturing cities are. So that's where people are going to live and move to. But we also see this happening in places in Latin America, in Asia and Africa, which we'll talk about in later units when we get into the urbanization patterns. So why move there, though? Think about it. Economic opportunities, cultural opportunities, social opportunities. There's more available in these areas, and that's why you see much more of a migration pattern there in LDCs, because their economies can only support urban economics here, whereas they don't have enough of an economic source and a base to be able to support the suburban or rural regions. Then we move here to suburbanization. All right, suburbanization, this suburban migration is going to be more prominent in MDCs. All right, you're going to see this occurring more in MDCs like the United States, Canada, UK, and parts of Western Europe. Okay, what happens is people are leaving urban areas and they're going to either want a slower way of life, they want less taxes, more space, bigger families. That is where you start to see more space, bigger houses for families. And so what you see is they move into the suburban population. So while urbanization is occurring more rapidly in LDCs, suburbanization is happening more frequently in MDCs. And then we see counter urbanization. So again, every migration has an equal or opposite counter migration. This is what we tend to see. As urban populations continue to decrease, people don't just stop in the suburbs anymore, but people are now moving even further out and going into more rural areas. They're want to slow down. They want to get a little bit more land, a little bit more space, have some ways to get away from HOAs. Hey, you know what? I don't want to have to deal with these homeowners associations. I want to get a little bit further out. Or I don't want to be in the city in the hustle and bustle. Let's get into a little bit more space and more land, and let's take care of ourselves. And that's where we see this counter urbanization really starting to occur. Again, still in more of your MDC locations. So if we look at this movement, again, out of the city to the suburb is more MDC. All right. Out of the suburb into the city is more LDC. And this counter urbanization is still MDC as well. So if we look at where migrations happen in the United States, bringing it back just to the United States again, our internal immigration pattern and our migration pattern inside. Early on, most of our settlement was going to be right over here on the colonial coast. Then we're going to see a shifting from the colonial coast as we move westward. Early on, we're able to get past the Appalachian Mountains. We're able to get moved closer to the Mississippi River, and we see things start to expand us with westward expansion. And so we move even further past the Appalachian Mountains, past the Mississippi River, and then we go into westward expansion, manifest destiny, and we move all the way out through California with the gold rush, and we think about those types of things. And then as that occurs, we start to give more incentives to bring people into the Midwest and the Great Plains of the United States, make land really cheap and give these incentives to kind of move into this region. And then post World War II, we see a southern migration where people start to move out and move into different areas out of the northeastern regions and corridors, and especially in modern day times, moving to more southern regions as we see more retirees moving into the Sun Belt and getting a changing the climate and the lifestyle for them, as well as the cost of living. But also, we're seeing more families out of the Northeast because of cost of living moving to a cheaper cost of living from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt, as well as jobs transfer from certain areas into other areas, which we'll get into in later units as well. So if we look at this and we start talking about this and we get into the early 20th century, we talk about the Great Migration of the African American Great Migration. And you studied this in your U.S. history classes before. And we talk about how they moved from the rural South in the early 20th century. We start thinking about what's going on in the early 1900s here in this country. We start to see the development of cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and even further in the Northeast and the West. What they're moving out there is for this economic opportunity that's there post-Reconstruction era as we get into that region. But if we think about the entire U.S. population, what we see is from the beginning, 1790, all right, post-American Revolution, we start to see the foundations of this country. We have continuously moved to a southwest direction. And in that southwest direction, if you look at it today, the central point of our population, and in 2020, it's just a little bit further southwest from here. But we wind up being right there in southwestern Missouri. So the central focus of our population has continuously moved southwest. So this is essentially the midpoint where half of the population's north of this point, half of the population in the U.S. is south of this point, half of the population is west and east of this point. We have seen across history, we have continuously moved south and west, and that kind of holds true with today's trends as well. So hopefully this gives you a good understanding of the migration patterns of the United States historically and the waves of migration. Hopefully this gives you an understanding of what's happening internally in the United States as far as the movement across the United States, as well as what are the movements internally in many countries, whether it be LDC or MDC, of urbanization, suburbanization, and counter-urbanization. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.